What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Iron Man. Yes, we are. The Books of Korvac Part 2. And this one, we're just going to cover the whole volume, right? We're not going to worry about splitting it in a little section, things like that. But coming out of the last video that we did, basically Korvac had launched an attack against Patsy Walker and Iron Man, and essentially incapacitated them both, which is just kind of a sheer display of the power of Michael Korvac. So much so that Tony Stark's entire suit is just shut down, right? I mean, it's literally been overloaded. The rest of the team, right? So like Misty Knight and Frogman, I love Frogman. So like Frogman, Gargoyle, those guys, they're all kind of recovering. They were able to help sort of guard people a little bit. Gargoyle's kind of recovering himself, right? Just because of the fact that he lost a wing, sustained huge injuries, different things like that. It's basically recovery time. And so when you end up picking back up with Tony Stark, what you end up getting here is this really cool moment where they basically start to kind of work on him as best they can, but they can't really do a whole lot. And the reason why is because of the injury that he sustained. This is one of those interesting things about Iron Man's suit, is that if they were to move him, they would, like, his neck is like one bad position away from killing him, right? It's already broken, right? So in order to keep him stabilized, it's like having a neck harness in the form of a suit. They have to actually modify the collar on his suit so his body doesn't move. And it's one of the crazy things because he's like, under any normal circumstance, he would have this tended to, they would get it taken care of. But Michael Korvac trying to return to power is no small thing. Now, again, because of the fact that this is an Iron Man story, under any normal circumstance, you would have him enlist the aid of the Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the whole nine yards. But Christopher Cantwell is going in the direction of saying, like, this is just a Tony Stark story. So is Tony Stark just dealing with it on his own? So obviously this seems like it's going to end in such a way to where Korvac's going to obviously be defeated and he's not going to become some massive calamity, right? Some universal wide threat or anything along those lines. But in the midst of all this, suddenly they're met by the arrival of James Rhodes. And James Rhodes is kind of the voice of reason here, right? Donning the War Machine suit, he's like, look, we got to get the Avengers in on this. And the response of Stark is, that's not going to happen, right? I mean, you do have one of the henchmen of Korvac who shows up, tries to instigate a fight. He gets taken out pretty quickly. But the whole idea behind James Rhodes is, fine, if this is really going to be the case and this is just going to be I've got to take care of it on my own, this is a personal vendetta kind of thing, then that's fine. Like, at the very least, I can come along and make sure that you don't get yourself killed, right? That kind of a thing. Now, again, people will kind of look at that and say, it's a little weird that Cantwell's turning this, what is basically a character who is a cosmic entity, right? Michael Korvac, at the peak of his power, was wildly powerful. He could reshape the universe as he so chose, based on his use of the power cosmic, right? The power of Galactus. A lot of people will look at that and say, it's weird that Cantwell's just turning this into an Iron Man story. I think it's cool. I think it's cool to have a character who is such a massive cosmic level threat that's not turning into yet another big crossover event in Marvel Comics, right? Where crossover events happen all the time, but instead is being held in the kind of capacity where it's facing off against Iron Man. This is old school, right? This is like 1970s, 1980s Marvel Comics. So while I'm not necessarily some old school hipster and I wish things could go back to the way they were 50 years ago, I don't. I do like the idea that we get these kind of little moments here where you get these small stories where what would normally be a giant Avengers class threat, probably even a universal threat involving a whole host of spacefaring characters and everything, instead of just being dealt with by Iron Man. So there's a couple things that you get here, which is kind of cool. You end up, of course, getting them, boarding Tony Stark's ship, basically taking off after Michael Korvac. War Machine gets a giant upgrade, so does Tony Stark. We're not really given the definitive nature of War Machine's upgrade. We're just told that he gets one, and that's really kind of it. But you actually have this really cool moment where you end up having Patsy Walker, who's basically brought in alongside Tony Stark by Michael Korvac, of course, using his powers and so on, basically kind of communicates to them that, like, this sort of lush planet, right? This lush, beautiful planet is kind of a physical manifestation, a representation of the utopia that he wants to bring to the universe. And again, this is one of the things that we talk about in like Injustice and different things like that, that if humanity and even just the entirety of the universe's denizens wanted the universe to be a better place, it would be. But the fact that it's not is an indication to the fact that they don't want it to be, whether it's by their own inaction or their direct action in keeping that from happening, apathy or intentional cause. The result is that people want things to be bad. And so at the end of the day, Korvac is kind of really appearing him, as this kind of guy that's saying, look, the universe is going to become a better place, whether you want it to or not, right? Like war, disease, famine, all that kind of stuff, hate, fear, it's all going away. I know a lot of you guys want it to stay, but it's not going to, right? It's all going to be eliminated. And it's kind of a funny thing because one of the things that we've seen is that in the face of that, superheroes almost stand in the way of making things better, right? That if the world and the universe is a crappy place because people out there want it to be, then in turn, superheroes saying no, they should have the right to choose whether or not the universe is good or bad, standing in the face of the guy who's going to say, like, I'm using all this power to make the world a better place, is in effect standing in the way of making the universe a better place, right? So they're literally working against progress. Like, they're literally working against the universe becoming a utopia. The argument that they really present here is no one person can have that power. And And the argument that's really presented here is based on Michael Korvac's previous escapades, which is his desire to kind of lay waste to everything, so on and so forth, which was not necessarily true. The funny thing about this is that Michael Korvac is more machine than man, so he's not really encumbered by emotion. And really, emotion is the source of virtually every bad decision anybody's ever made, right? Emotional decisions are inherently bad decisions. Logical decisions are inherently the best decisions, right? What's best for the greatest number of people? The greatest number of people having peace and prosperity and not having to worry about pain and suffering, that's what's best for the universe. So we're gonna do that, right? It's an interesting concept, right? It really is this kind of, freedom versus security argument that's being presented here. And so because what you get is Iron Man and essentially Patsy Walker standing in the face of that, the whole thing is just kind of dispersed, and Iron Man is just teleported to some weird location, right? Just kind of sent away, where he's met by what's called the Colony Patrol. Now, we'll talk about them here in a little bit, but what you end up doing here is switching over and really picking up with like Korvac and his guys chasing after, James Rhodes and, trying to destroy their ship so they can't get in the way of his mission and all that kind of crazy stuff. But in the midst of all that, suddenly Patsy Walker is met by a telepathic communication, which actually turns out to be coming from Moondragon. Now, Heather Douglas is interesting. Heather Douglas is cool. She's probably one of the more important characters in the history of Marvel Comics. She is a hugely powerful telepath, right? She has all kinds of wild abilities, at least on a telepathic level. And really, depending on who's been writing the story over the years, if you go and you look at the old school like Jim Starlin stuff, she was telepathically powerful on a universal scale, right? If you look at the more recent stories like Dan Abnett, Annihilation Conquest, she's not necessarily on that same level of power, but she still is immensely powerful. More so than that, her and Patsy Walker have an interesting relationship in the sense that in years past, when Patsy Walker had these powers and it basically started driving her insane, that Moondragon was the one who shut those powers off. And so what Moondragon has done is realizing that because Korvac is returning here, they really kind of need all hands on deck. And Patsy Walker's ability to emanate telepathic abilities, or at the very least, to ride the radio waves of telepathic powers, is exceedingly important here. And in fact, that's actually what saves the day. Because while you do get this whole thing where you get like the backstory of Patsy Walker, none of it really matters, her powers are basically woken up, right? And so when you have Korvac and these guys who are basically chasing down James Rhodes and all them, she uses her powers to essentially spawn illusions in the face of Michael Korvac of the Badoon, right? Like his worst fear in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about why here in a second, but spawns, illusions of the Badoon, which really distract Korvac and everybody else enough to where they basically stop dead in their tracks, which gives James Rhodes and everybody the ability to kind of fire up their engines and take off as fast as they can, right? Now, following that, you kind of pick up with this whole Korvac thing, right? This whole really discussion with Korvac. So this really starts in the year 2997, right? The Korvac is from the far-flung future and technically an alternate reality, depending on how you want to look at it. But the important thing is that by this point in time, the Badoon have conquered a huge section of the universe and have actually set their sights on Earth. And so what you had at that point was essentially a rebel faction, right? These kind of individuals out there who were looking to stop the Badoon from essentially conquering Earth. At that point, a lot of humanity, or at least some portion of humanity, worked for the Badoon, really more as servants and slaves than anything else. But the big thing is that Korvac shows up here as part of their ranks and then kills them all, only to find out that he's working for the Badoon, right? He's working directly for them, and that has essentially, eliminated this kind of faction, this really rebel regiment, to ensure that there's no real resistance, nobody to warn Earth that an invasion of the Badoon is coming. Now, again, at this point in time, Korvac was really just an employee, right? I mean, we're really just like a servant working for the Badoon themselves. And so what ended up happening is that because he abandoned his station and didn't do what he was supposed to, right? Didn't stay there, what they ended up doing was taking his human components and basically merging them with cybernetic components. And so he was one part man, one part machine. He was a cyborg, and he had the ability to interface with the machines. This was the explanation Marvel provided as to how he became as powerful as he was. That in the original Michael Korvac saga, way back in the day in Marvel, that what he did is he actually traveled to the world ship of Galactus to Tatu, and then quote unquote downloaded the power cosmic. And that's what made him so powerful. That's what he's looking to do again, right? So this is not Michael Korvac who's been recreated as a character who just kind of exists, right? Just kind of a copy of his former self. This is actually Michael Korvac who's been brought back. And that's kind of a cool thing. Now, something that's a little wonky is that along the way to the world ship of Galactus, they're kind of recruiting allies. And one of the places they travel to is this world that's largely kind of been far-flung and cast off, only to find the original Human Torch, Jim Hammond. Now, the events that led to him being here really come out of like the Invaders comics. We haven't really covered those, although they are pretty good. We may cover them at some future point in time, but one of the big changes that kind of comes out of this, one of the things that's kind of given here is that with Korvac, it's kind of a weird blend. Michael Korvac was basically reinstated or brought back by the Enclave, who created Adam Warlock and called him Adam, but they call Korvac Adam 1. And the weird thing here is that that Korvac basically refers to Jim Hammond as essentially being Atom 4. And so in essence, it's almost as though Cantwell is kind of blending the old Phineas Horton origin for creating Jim Hammond with like the Enclave and creating Adam Warlock, almost kind of blending them together. Now, as far as I'm aware, Phineas Horton was never part of the Enclave. He never joined the Enclave, right? He was not really hell-bent on trying to conquer the world through science. If anything, he was just obsessed with getting credit for having created the first android. But regardless of how you slice it here, because of the fact that Jim Hammond is an android, Korvac approaches him because he believes he's best suited to truly understand what the mission of Korvac is, right? Korvac's desire to bring peace and prosperity. And so what you end up having is the two of them traveling together, and Korvac, of course, upgrades the body of Jim Hammond, giving him enhanced abilities, but then at the same time, hooks him up to a system that basically allows him to process and to see what it is that Korvac is looking to do. Now, the two of their minds are connected, right? Because as machines, they can transfer information back and forth in the same way you transfer information from a computer to a USB drive. And so what this does is it basically shows the kind of Korvac events whereby the Avengers approach and they ask him about what's going on, you know, and they try to stop him from what it is that he's doing. And he basically ends up killing the Avengers in the process. And one of the things is that when this happens, Jim Hammond turns on him. And again, this is kind of a funny thing because the reality is whenever you're instituting a giant cause like this, right, like bringing peace and prosperity to those who don't want it, they're going to try to stop it. And so as a result of that, you're going to have to move them out of the way, right? There are going to be forces out there that were going to be roadblocks in your way. And ultimately, if the ends truly do justify the means, and because of their own natures, they're incapable of seeing it, then you just have to get rid of them, right? You literally just, that's the only thing that you can do. If you cannot convince them, if you cannot get them to understand where you're coming from, if you try everything you can, which is literally what Korvac's been doing, and at the end of the day, they just refuse to accept the reality of the situation, then the only alternative is to eliminate them, right? To remove them from the equation and then continue on your goal to peace and prosperity. It's literally happened across the entirety of civilization. And so because of this, Korvac comes to this realization that Jim Hammond will never really ally himself with him. And so where a controller disc is put on Hammond to kind of keep him under control, it really is a little crushing to Korvac because he wasn't looking for a servant, right? He wasn't looking for a slave. He was looking for an ally, somebody that could truly understand where he was coming from and truly help him achieve this goal. And so it's kind of an interesting thing here because having the power of Jim Hammond is no small thing, right? The original Human Torch. This guy's not necessarily on the same power level as the Human Torch Johnny Storm, but he is pretty damn powerful, right? He's pretty capable. And so what you end up doing is switching over to this planet that Iron Man is currently on. And one of the funny things here is that as he's in this world and as he's there spending time with these people, he of course comes across a woman by the name of Yar, who's basically the one that leads the show. Now, Yar doesn't have any real existing history in Marvel. She's a new creation for this story, but the environment and the way this whole place exists, it really is by all standards of measurement what you would define as a communist society, right? There's no money here, right? There's no real income or anything like that. There's simply resources and those who share them. Now, truth to tell, if this society grew large enough, you would either run into a barter system that would evolve into money, or it would just turn straight into money, right? You look at like any political philosopher out there and they will tell you when you go from a state of nature, which is what this is, to an organized society, then somehow or another money's going to get involved, right? It's just the nature of us as the human race. We're primitive, right? We are pretty primitive and pretty basic, and we haven't quite figured out that there's more important things in the world than cash. So because of that, the whole thing is that Tony Stark kind of experiences this sense of belonging that he never really experienced before, right? This sense of community, camaraderie. He even goes as far as to say, I never got along with the Avengers this well. It's kind of a funny thing. Now, one of these guys is also Colin Richards, also known as Avro X. He appeared back in Marvel Fanfare issue number 44 back in the day. It's okay. I mean, it's not a major character, right? It's not a great, big, huge thing. It's not a massive thing at all. But while Tony Stark is kind of exploring the area, waiting to be called forward by basically the guy who runs the show, that he ends up coming across an Ultimo. Now, the Ultimo was nuts. Now, Ultimo was a character who appeared in Tales of Suspense number 76 back in 1966. The Ultimo was not like the biggest deal ever when he first showed up, but as time progressed, and especially when characters like the Mandarin got his hands on him, he became a hoss, right? Like the Ultimos are designed to be insanely durable. Now, the funny thing about this is that initially the Ultimo only had like maybe 30 appearances in Marvel Comics. So Christopher Cantwell is by all standards of measurement working with a blank slate here. He can kind of modify the history of the Ultimo Ultimos as he sees fit, which is exactly what's going on here. We never really knew where the Ultimo came from. We never really knew where it originated from. We just knew that it was there one day, and then it was being used by different villains, and it was operating of its own accord. It could run at like 100 miles an hour. It stood at like 100 feet tall, right? These things were colossal in size. But where Tony Stark realizes that it is essentially a machine-powered organism, he of course helps to power his own suit, realizing that it's enzymatic along the way, right? There are enzymes blended with this technology, so it seems to be partly biological in nature. And so while he doesn't necessarily pick up immediately on the fact that it's an Ultimo, he realizes like this thing's got biological components. It's really more of a passing interest than anything else, when suddenly he's met by the arrival of Yar, who says like, the big guy will see you now. And so when Tony Stark gets there, he realizes it's Wilbur Day. It's the Stilt-Man. So Stilt-Man was created by Stan Lee and Wally Wood in Daredevil number 8 back in 1965. He's never been a big time threat in Marvel Comics, right? I mean, he's literally, as you see him, that's what he does, right? Like, he originally stole the technology from his employer, a guy named Carl Caxton, and then used it for his own ends, and he fought Daredevil a little bit, ended up in a bit of a criminal history there, but he was never significant, right? Wilbur Day was never one of those guys where it's like, oh my God, here comes Stilt-Man. That was never gonna happen, right? It's like, okay, here comes Stilt-Man. Well, you know, he's literally the guy that Daredevil's fighting when the story opens, right? Just to kind of show what Daredevil's doing at the time. That's basically how Stilt-Man was, and really always has been in Marvel Comics. But the funny thing is, Stilt-Man hasn't been seen in Marvel for a long time. And that's one of the funny things here, is that as the two of them are kind of talking, Iron Man's like, damn, man, like it's weird seeing you here. His knowledge of Wilbur Day is that he only ever got involved with people if he could achieve his own personal end, right? He's really just kind of a jerk. And so Iron Man's whole thing is like, okay, so like you're leading this whole thing, what do you get out of this, right? Like, I mean, what's in it for you? He expects him to be this villain that he's familiar with, but one of the things that Iron Man quickly learns is that like, there's no room for that here, right? That everybody's just trying to live, right? They're just like, they've all just kind of been thrust here, teleported here in the same way that Iron Man has, right? That somewhere along the line, something happened, and in the blink of an eye, they suddenly woke up here. Wilbur Day was one of the first, but the character of Yar, she was a member of the Kree army, right? Like a Kree colonist, and was just like teleported here, right? Everybody's just kind of been yanked here somewhere along the line. This is quite literally an island of misfit toys, right? That's basically what this is. Characters who are minor, small, irrelevant, never had any major role, and there's no real logic or reason to why they're here in the first place. Honestly, I love that Cantwell's doing this. It's creative. It's really, really creative. I thought it was cool. Like, this never would have occurred to me. And so the fact that everybody's just kind of been yanked here and they're just trying to live in this ecosystem, it's cool, right? Because it's basically really kind of showing these people for what they are. If these people really do anything, it solidifies the views of Michael Korvac, right? That like, you can have a utopia, like you can have this kind of environment, but notice like it's a cast off. These people never would have lived in this environment had they not been forced into it, right? The circumstances led to them becoming where they are, or at least kind of living this life that they're living in, right? So there really is legitimacy to Korvac's argument here, right? It's really kind of interesting because even Iron Man finds himself letting his guard down. Of course, he explains why he can't take his suit off, that if he does, it'll break his neck and he'll die. But like, he's just kind of enjoying his life, right? I mean, he's literally playing baseball with him, right? Just kind of enjoying this utopian lifestyle and just kind of chilling here to the point that he almost kind of doesn't want to leave. But then suddenly they're met by the arrival of one of the Ultimos who gets here. And that's when you kind of learn this little bit of a dark history here when it comes to the Ultimos, is that they, one, originated from this planet, and two, killed the people who created them, right? That this basically seems to be the place where they originated from, and those individuals who created them were ultimately destroyed. And the way in which these Ultimos power themselves is by basically consuming enzymes, right? The reason why they're partly biological is one of them basically ends up grabbing Yar and then eats her, right? Like literally consumes her. And that's when Iron Man realizes, wow, like this is basically how it is that they're biological. This story has in effect turned into Attack on Titan. Right? Those giant robots roaming around eating people. I assume that's what it is. Never really watched Attack on Titan. Well, I take that back. Benny over at Comic Story and tried to get me into anime by having me watch Attack on Titan. It was weird. People keep telling me I should watch it. I mean, I've seen like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. It took me a little while to get into it, but ultimately I got into it. Mariah got me into that just because of the fact that she watches it so often. I have basically watched the entire series of Avatar: The Last Airbender, even though I guess it's not technically an anime, but I saw a bunch of those. So I guess I might as well sit down and watch, Attack on Titan right? All these giant robots who are just eating people. I think it's weird, right? It's weird that giant robots are eating people, but hey, who am I to complain about anime being weird? But nonetheless, it's one of these funny things, because with this Ultimo being destroyed, the reality is that in this environment in which they've lived, that the Ultimos are basically the predators, right? You know, it's like living out there in Africa, and you have to contend with like lions and different things like that, right? Those apex predators that exist in that ecosystem, and then suddenly here comes Iron Man and takes out one of the Ultimos, right? It's like the ages of primitive man, when all they could do was run away from predators, and then suddenly men developed spears, right? Humanity developed spears, we developed fire, things like that, tools and resources that could be used that could elevate us from having been lower on the totem pole to being the apex predator on Earth, right? It's really what's being introduced here, a modification to the ecosystem. And so Iron Man isn't necessarily lauded as being like a leader and like taking over the role of controlling everything, but it's one of these things where it's just kind of like, okay, you know, it's like he kind of looks around and he says like, so you say there's more of these things out there, but what you've built here is something beautiful, right? Like we shouldn't let those things destroy this, right? So what we should do is go in and take care of it, right? We should go handle these things, right? He's almost kind of like their sort of field commander, their protector in a lot of ways, because in reality, he's like, I like it here, right? I want to help you here. And again, the kind of note that's left on here by Christopher Cantwell is Iron Man doesn't really seem to want to leave. He kind of wants to stay. So with that being said, guys, that wraps up the books of Korvac Volume 2. I guess we'll now have to wait for Volume 3 to come out. I'm loving it, right? I'm loving what Cantwell's doing with Iron Man. I'm gonna be honest, this is some of the most enjoyment I've had reading Iron Man's comics since really Kieran Gillen's run, right? The secret origin of Tony Stark and all that stuff, the introduction of Arno and everything. I'm really digging it. I think it's some of the best Iron Man writing since then. But with that being said, guys, let me know what you guys think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.